Hey guys, it's Chili here. Welcome back. Today we've got a sneak peek of the new Japanese civilization coming to AOE4 with the Sultans Ascend DLC. This is the final civilization to be revealed, and it's also one of the most anticipated civs that fans have been clamoring for. I think it's a really smart idea from the devs to put it in a DLC because not only do I personally know a few folks who are interested in getting AOE4 just for the Japanese, but you just know that there's a bunch of weebs out there smelling that new Japanese content, sharpening their wakizashis, getting ready. So let's just get this out of the way first. This faction looks great. I'm really excited by what I'm seeing here, and I think it'll be a ton of fun to play. I'm particularly excited to hear the soundtrack because you just know that thing's gonna slap. Japan's such an interesting and unique civilization, not just in the game, but also in real life. When I designed my concept for them, I found it quite challenging. They've got history going on that no one else has, and I think the choices made by the design team are quite interesting. In this video, I'll be going over everything that was announced for the Japanese, and I'll be analyzing the design decisions and comparing it to how I would have designed the Japanese. Anyways, let's dive right into it. Starting out, we're going to take a look at this faction art. Now, this is one of the best pieces I've seen yet for this game. I love that we're in a snowy biome here. I think that makes it the second cover image that takes place in a snow biome, the other one being the Mongols, and interestingly, both snow biome pieces feature an Asian woman on the front. That's kind of weird. Fun fact, I'm not sure if there's any snowboarders out there listening, but Japan's well known to have some of the best ski resorts in the world, especially in Hokkaido. Although I doubt that this image takes place in Hokkaido, during the medieval era, Hokkaido was largely untouched by all the drama going on down south. We do see a heroine front and center clad in samurai armor wielding a naginata, very much resembling the popular image of the Onnabugeisha, the prominent female samurai that were known to be fierce warriors often called upon to defend their homes while the men were away. The naginata was the weapon most closely associated with them, and it does look like she's defending her village from some samurai raiders or something. And we see in this village that there's thatched roof houses, very commonly seen in Japanese architecture. In fact, there are some very popular, well-preserved historic villages that you can visit today. You'll see exactly this kind of architecture. And maybe I'm just seeing things, but this guy over here looks like a ninja or something. Anyways, according to the opening blurb, the Japanese in-game will span the time period from the late 8th century up until the early 17th century. The late 8th century puts it right at the beginning of the Heian period, which started in 794, and the early 17th century puts it right at the end of the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, and the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate, which was in 1603. All of this lines up quite nicely with what I predicted in my own Japanese concept. These dates are very sensible for encompassing AOE4's timeline. That's where the similarities to my concept end, however. In my concept, I imagine a civilization that was focused around shrines and shoguns, with units that were stronger but more expensive, with a lot of glass cannon elite samurai units. But it seems like the Order of the Dragon will be fulfilling that archetype, and instead Japan will be based around its unique town center, which can be upgraded based on this daimyo system. It can become a daimyo manor and then eventually a shogunate castle, which sports defensive and farming related bonuses. Now, this is an interesting concept and reminds me of the Zerg Hive in StarCraft, which could also be upgraded, as well as the Wehrmacht faction in Company of Heroes, which had escalation phases that you can upgrade at your headquarters. Personally, I don't think Japanese town centers, or whatever we consider their historic parallel, were so distinct that this would be the best civilization to apply this design mechanic to. I think that something like the Incan or maybe like an Aztec pyramid design would fit this concept much better, especially the Incans now that I think about it, since they had such a centralized power structure. But whatever, I'm fine with it. I'm excited to see how this turns out, and what does this mean for Japanese players that want to build multiple TCs, or how would this overlap with keeps? I'm also really glad that the devs moved away from AOE3 style daimyo and shoguns, which were just tanky mobile barracks that were always used to sneak into your backline and backdoor you. They were so annoying to deal with in that game. Additionally, we have confirmation that Japan will have unique mines, which also function as blacksmiths, called forges, as well as unique houses called farmhouses that also function as food drop-offs. This is really unexpected. I don't get why the devs would add this mechanic. It seems a bit arbitrary to me, and I don't know if it adds all that much. I mean, maybe the house will be interesting, as you can maybe see Japanese players building houses when they're hunting deer. That's a bit reminiscent of the Japanese shrines in AOE3, but making a blacksmith mine hybrid is just a little bit weird. Like, what's the point? I guess you can get your blacksmith a little bit earlier. Japan seems to have an extra tier of melee damage, which sounds interesting, but I'm not really sure what they're trying to do with that one. Anyways, let's get into the units next. The opening blurb mentions the samurai bannermen. Now, we don't get official confirmation, but I'm fairly certain that that's referring to these guys right here. Not only do these guys look super cool, but you can see that they have these distinct sashimono banners on their back. Now, I've complained about the naming standards in AOE4 in the past, and I think that applies here as well. Calling them samurai bannermen is a bit weird, since samurai seems to be an in-game unit already as a separate unit, and additionally, bannerman is kind of a vague term that could have been applied apply to any number of unique units. I personally would have liked that name to have been saved for a faction with less well-known unit names. In this case, Samurai Bannermen are clearly based after the Hatamotos, which you might recall from AOE3. Hatamotos basically translates to Bannermen. It's a lord's closest retainers, personal bodyguards, and their most powerful warriors. When I first saw this unit, I predicted that they'd be able to transition between different stances, sword, bow, or cavalry. And there's no confirmation here, but since the preview only mentions a single unit, the Samurai Bannermen, I think it's fairly safe to assume that we will indeed be able to switch stances with one unit here, which is a very cool concept. We don't have a unit that can do that in AOE4 yet. The Ottoman Sipahi were tested to be able to switch between range and melee stances, but then the mechanic was cut prior to release. But now we have the Ayuba Desert Raider, which seem to be able to switch stances between ranged and melee, so I guess we'll be getting two different units that can switch stances. And lastly, it seems that the Bannermen can provide some kind of attack bonus aura to nearby units, which is a cool mechanic. In my concept for the Japanese, I had this Shogun unique unit that gave different kinds of bonus attack buffs, so I'm really curious to see how this will work in game. Now, there is some mention of deflective armor, and the way it's phrased, it's a bit unclear whether this refers to the Samurai Bannermen or just normal samurai. So why don't we just move on to the samurai next? This unit is not confirmed, but I'm fairly certain based on the available screenshots that we have that we will be getting a unit called Samurai, which seems to replace the men-at-arms for Japan. I'm guessing that their unique shtick will be that deflective armor, which periodically blocks attacks. It seems like it's going to be some kind of passive ability, and I'm personally not all that impressed with this mechanic. Essentially, it just makes the samurai a little bit more tanky, but only in selective circumstances, and I can see how this would be really useful in the early game, where you're only working with a handful of units, so each individual hit is more impactful. But late game, it just seems like something that you forget about. Plus, there's not really a historical basis here. Samurai armor was not particularly deflective in any way. In fact, it's probably less deflective than European plate armor, which was rounded to maximize arrow deflection. Samurai armor was pretty flimsy compared to European steel. We do see a mix of different samurai types here in these images. Some are wielding naganatas, some are wielding what looks like katanas or nodachis. It's not confirmed, but just something I've been predicting for a while now. My guess is that the samurai will start out wielding naganatas in the feudal age, but then can be upgraded to wield katanas or nodachis once they hit the castle age. This is cool, since despite the katana being popularly associated with samurai, historically katanas were not a common battlefield weapon, and naganatas were much more the primary weapon for most samurai. Katanas were more of a symbolic thing, especially once we entered the relatively peaceful Edo period, where battlefield weapons were no longer necessary, and so the katana became a status symbol. Speaking of naganatas, I want to highlight this strange unit over here. We've seen this unit on a number of occasions now, and have yet to receive any kind of confirmation on what it is exactly. It's clearly a naganata wielding unit wearing some kind of armor, but it lacks a helmet, which makes it very visually distinct from the samurai that also wield naganatas. Since naganatas were so popularly associated with the Onnabugeisha, I'm guessing that this is a naganata wielding Onnabugeisha type of unit, which is what we saw in the cover art. What gives me pause though is that the Onna Musha is already represented in the game, so there seems to be quite a bit of overlap here. Would the devs really add two Japanese warrior women units? Especially considering that the Onna Musha just literally translates to warrior women, it seems a bit redundant. In my concept, I featured Sohei monks as a special unit that also famously wielded naganatas, and so part of me was hoping that we'd see these guys in their distinct outfits represented in the game. Anyway, speaking of the Onna Musha, let's move on to those gals. The Onna Musha serve as the crossbowman replacement for Japan. Japan historically did not use crossbows. The mountainous terrain of the region made it very hard to raise pack animals, which meant that Japan didn't really have the industries for glue and sinew that were necessary for crossbow manufacture. And additionally, Japanese armor was made from lower quality metal, so Japanese bows already performed just fine already. Giving the anti-armor function to a horse archer is very interesting though. I'm not sure how I feel about it. Horse archer was absolutely of prime importance in medieval Japan, and was the favorite combat style of samurai prior to the Warring States period. In my concept, I gave Japan armored horse archers in Age 2, and called them Yabusame, which was also a unit back in AOE 3. These guys would function like Rus horse archers, but with much more staying power. And I personally would have preferred that, since the armored horse archer is an archetype that we haven't seen yet, and there won't be many other opportunities to introduce such a unit in other civilizations. Additionally, the game has already set a standard to where bow wielding units are light infantry counters, so it'll be a little bit weird for this bow wielding unit to buck the trend. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but I was personally hoping for a little bit more consistency here. That being said, in my concept, I removed crossbows from Japan entirely, and I didn't give them any alternative. So instead, I imagined Japan's anti-armor capabilities to be tied to the Shogun, which gave some kind of anti-armor buff aura. I think this also could have been confusing, but at least it stayed consistent with how bows work in the game currently. Another approach could have been to make a unit that uses the Kanabo War Club, which if you've played For Honor, you might be familiar with. We already see the Musafari warriors for Mali being anti-armor units. It's not that much of a surprise to see a War Club wielding unit to also counter armor. The other unit that I think Japan should lack is the Lancer or Knight. In my concept, I replaced them with the Naginata Rider, which is also inspired by AOE 3, and they basically function as a mounted lance connect, a glass cannon kind of AOE damaging unit. Historically, Japanese horses were small and ill-suited for cavalry charges, so it doesn't really make a lot of sense to give Japan heavy cavalry. Japanese horses were well adapted to the rough mountainous terrain there, which made them great for horse archery, but it wasn't until the Warring States period that we finally get some Lancer-ish looking units, most famously from the Takeda cavalry, but even in those cases it was mostly light cavalry, mostly used to chase and disrupt rather than to charge home the way you might see on European battlefields. So I maintain that it's really weird to see Japanese heavy Shinobi Lancers. The armor and the horse barding looks really cool though, and it's probably inspired by this piece. And I like that they wield naganatas, but this is just kind of a made-up unit. The round shields are also really questionable. This unit doesn't really look Japanese. It looks more like a Total War Warhammer Cathay unit or something. We also see these round shields on Japanese horsemen, which is also a little bit weird. Next, let's take a sneak peek at Japanese gunpowder units. This one here looks like the Handcannoneer. I think it looks great. The hand cannons they're using seems to be the standard hand cannons used by every other faction. I was wondering if they were going to go for something unique like the matchlock arquebus or call them ashigaru or something like that, but that doesn't quite seem to be the case here. My guess is that these are standard hand cannoneers, but they do have this interesting back scabbard looking thing, so there might be something unique going on with these guys. Additionally, we have the Ozutsu, basically a hand mortared kind of unit. This is very cool, and this was not a unit that I knew about nor expected. I don't have much to say on this other than that I'm excited to see them in game. The fact that they work like long-range grenadiers tells me that these guys will either be very broken OP and spammed every game, or they'll be very broken underpowered and never used. Speaking of broken OP, we have the Shinobi, which in addition to having a smoke bomb are hinted at being able to reappear in new locations, suggesting that we might be getting a blink ability a la the Stalkers from StarCraft 2. I personally think that'd be pretty awesome. One of the disadvantages of creating a historically themed game is that you lose out on a lot of cool gameplay potential that a sci-fi or fantasy setting would have provided. Blinking Stalkers were always a really cool gameplay mechanic, and finding a way to add that mechanic to a historical setting is something that I think would be a great design. Obviously, it wouldn't really be true to history, but the rule of cool here kind of trumps historical accuracy. Plus, it reminds me of the Shinobi from For Honor. The Shinobi ability to disguise as a villager and sabotage structure sounds a little bit weird though. I wonder how this will play in team games. Like, would you have to choose a specific player to disguise as? Lastly, we have the Spearmen, which I'm guessing will work as the standard Spearmen, though I'm a bit sad that we don't see Yari spears represented in the game. And instead we have this Chinese plume-looking spear, and then they evolve into this European billhook-looking spear. Beastie did mention that Japanese archers won't play like standard archers either. We had the Yumi archers back in AOE3, and it looks like the archers in AOE4 will have this interesting zebra print on them. All in all, that makes at least 6 unique units for Japan, which is getting up there in terms of complexity creep in the game. Again, like with the LU bids, I'm hoping that the devs stay a bit more disciplined with how many unique units they want to introduce into the game, lest it creates way too much burden of information on new players. Let's move on to the landmarks now. For H2, we have the Koka Township landmark, which produces the aforementioned Shinobi. It's not clear whether this is the only place to train Shinobi, but my guess is that this unit is indeed tied to this landmark. This is something I did in my concept as well. I made Shinobi tied to the Golden Pavilion landmark in H4, as Shinobi and ninjas were really more prominent during the Sengoku period in the 16th century. In retrospect though, the micro-intensive Shinobi unit would play much better in H2, where you have much less to deal with on the map and can afford to focus on a single unit much more. The historical reference here is quite on point. Koka or Koga was the region of the Koga Ryu school of ninjutsu, one of the main ninja schools during the Warring States period, and the landmark in game bears a striking resemblance to the ninja house in Koka today, which is a popular tourist attraction. The other landmark is the Kura Storehouse, which is a universal drop-off and can generate free farms. This is a really cool concept and I love this idea. Generating free farms will save the player a ton of wood, but I wonder how it'll deal with space constraints. Kura are traditional Japanese storehouses and were used as granaries or for storing various other things. Takakura, or tall storehouses, were raised as we see here in this picture, and were prominent as early as the Yayoi period. This specific landmark bears a striking resemblance to the raised storehouses seen in Yoshinogari Park. In H3 we get the floating gate, which allows players to train Shinto priests. Now, while nothing in Japan looks quite like this, it's most likely a reference to the massive torii gate of Itsukishima Shrine, which famously appears to float in water. Torii gates in Shinto belief are portals into the spirit world. I'm really happy to see this landmark represented in game, and it was something that I included in my design as well. It seems like in game, Shinto priests will be able to place Yorishiro into buildings to get special bonuses. I looked up Yorishiro, I've never heard of that before. It seems like it's some kind of sacred object in Shintoism. I had pointed out in the past that these boxes here look like saisen, which are Shinto offering boxes, and it seems like there's some kind of bonus that comes up on top of these boxes. I wonder if this is just how Japan does their relics or something. The other landmark that we have is the Temple of Quality, which allows you to train Buddhist monks. We don't have a picture of it, but I'd be a little shocked if we don't get the Great Buddha or the Golden Pavilion here. Both are extremely well known and historically important Buddhist landmarks in this time period, and their names and appearances are iconic and would easily add to the architectural diversity in the faction. Buddhist monks in the game seem to be a unique unit that can reduce enemy damage in some way. The fact that Japan gets Buddhist monks and Shinto priests is a little bit weird. Does that mean that Japanese monasteries won't be able to train regular monks, and instead you'll just train one or the other depending on which landmark you choose? I think this mechanic does a great job of representing religion in Japan. Zen Buddhism spread from China to Japan during the Middle Ages, and while it became very popular, it never fully supplanted the native Shinto religion. I really appreciate the historically inspired detail here, but it is a bit surprising to me. In H4 we have the Tanegashima Gunsmith. This is a really cool historical reference. I mentioned this in my concept video that Tanegashima was one of the main trade ports for the Portuguese, and there's a really interesting story where it just so happened that a Portuguese adventurero was blown off course in a Chinese junk and landed in Tanegashima and traded some arquebuses with the local lord. The lord then had his swordsmiths reverse engineer the guns and started producing these Tanegashima arquebuses, which would go on and completely completely transform warfare in Japan. This is a very cool structure, and it seems like it allowed Japan to train the Ozutsu as well as Rubaldaquins, and I'm guessing that other gunpowder units can be trained here as well, but I doubt that the Handcannoneer and the Bombard will be restricted to this landmark. Sadly, I couldn't find any specific historical references for this structure. Let me know if you guys have any ideas. The other landmark we don't have an image for, but it's called the Castle of the Crow, which exists in real life. Matsumoto Castle was an important fortress during the Sengoku Jidai, and was called the Crow Castle because of its distinct black exterior. In-game, it seems to generate treasure caravans, which seem to be some kind of special traders that can travel over land and water. I'm really confused by this mechanic. Not only does the Castle of the Crow historically have nothing to do with trade caravans, but Japan itself is famously isolationist. And even before the Edo period, Japan was on the edge of the world, and its engagement with trade was nominal at best. Why would Japan get some kind of unique trade mechanic? I couldn't find any reference to treasure caravans in Japan, so let me know if you guys know anything about this. I think this is a very weird unit to give to Japan, especially when a faction like China, historically one of the main players on the Silk Road, which also specifically had treasure ships, doesn't get anything resembling a trade bonus. Lastly, I just want to make one more call out to the Wonder. It's this big pagoda looking structure. I've mentioned before that I have no idea what this structure is referenced to, and I continue to not have any clue. I don't know if Japan has any famous or particularly tall pagodas. If you guys have a clue, please let me know. I'm a bit confused why they'd move away from the Todaiji, which was the Japanese wonder in AOE2. Anyways, that's everything I know about Japan. I'm really hyped to test these guys out. What about you guys? What do you guys think about what's been revealed for Japan? I want to hear all of your thoughts in the comments below, or if you want to talk to me directly, feel free to join my Discord. The link is in the bio. I'll be posting a ton more AOE4 content in the coming days, so follow to get the latest. That's all from me, fellas. Stay frosty, stay chilly.